Hello people from YouTube, I'm Felipe Durante, a Brazilian engineer living in the south of China, and let's see when China will collapse.
No, China is not about to collapse.
Okay.
Very recently, there have been a slew of videos on YouTube that have been making the rounds and being shared around saying that China's about to collapse in 34 days, or the CCP will collapse in X amount of days, China's economy is going to collapse in 20...
I thought this was only in Brazil, but it looks like everyone else is doing videos like that.
5 days, 22 days, I don't even know how many days. I have no idea where they're getting these ridiculous day figures from, but
Nobody
I
knows.
must assure you all that this is not true. I'm not here to poo-poo those other YouTubers, by the way. A lot of what they say in their videos is correct. However, a lot of them have got it wrong, and I'm going to explain to you, especially since a lot of these other videos have actually used footage and information, I'm guessing, from my own videos. So there's one video in particular that was being shared to me a lot because a lot of people recognized my footage inside of this video, a lot of the footage I took in ghost towns and that sort of thing. And I went to take a look at it, I watched it, and I did leave a comment saying I'm very happy for people to use my footage. I'm that kind of person, I don't care. If you want to use footage from my YouTube channel, go ahead. But it's nice to give me a little shout out or, you know, maybe...
Actually, YouTube can recognize if someone else is using your footage, and they'll tell you. You'll let you know, like you'll send a message saying, hey, someone is using footage, so you don't really need people telling you that.
You know, maybe a little credit in the description down there somewhere would be nice.
That
seems like they shadow banned my
part I
comment,
agree.
so nobody could read it, and that's pretty unprofessional in the YouTube circles anyway. The fact of the matter is that you cannot put a date on the so-called collapse of the CCP or the Chinese economy. I'm not saying that the Chinese economy isn't going to collapse to a certain degree, because it has already, and it's continuing to spiral down in many different sectors. The thing is, it's the absolute control that the CCP has over the media and the populace that will prevent a big Lehman Brothers style collapse, financial crisis.
Also, China controls the banks. It's not the opposite, like in the United States. The banks control the government. In 2008, with all that, the subprime situation, the government sent money to the banks and companies, and those directors were making a lot of money in bonus. Meanwhile, people are living on the streets in cars because they lost their houses. That's the priority. That's how we see the difference. This will not happen in China. China will not just save the banks. China will find a way to save the people.
Financial crisis 2008 that we saw here in America and that we saw in places like Japan in the late 80s, early 90s. One cannot underestimate just how much control the Chinese government has over what happens in China, what people know about in China, and what is allowed to happen in China. You see, a lot of these other YouTubers and financial experts and so on are basing their ideas and their information off of the fact that in most democratic countries around the world, most developed countries, even developing countries, if they were to face what China is facing right now, as far as a massive property bubble with the ghost cities, this big Ponzi scheme, with the banks now withholding people's money, making excuses to freeze accounts, things like that.
This was 3 small banks. It happened in 3 small banks. It's not like the biggest banks of China are holding the money and not allowing people to withdraw it. It's like 3 small banks. It happened in one place of China months ago. It's not all over the country. And the government already punished the guys from the banks because there was some kind of scheme. Things are solved already.
Things like that. In most countries, yes, you would see a massive economic collapse, but China is not most countries, because most countries,
Yes.
especially democratic countries, have a little...
I like those kind of graphics or whatever, because this is made by the United States. So of course they will say, yeah, we are 83 out of 100 in the freedom index, and China is 9 out of 100. Like, of course, they're the enemy now, right? China is the enemy. Of course they will say China is bad.
little something called freedom of press, freedom of speech. You know, when something bad goes down, people can hear about it. People have the right to protest if their bank suddenly decides to steal all their money, for instance. In China, no.
Yeah, but in US there is 30 million people who doesn't have enough food every day. They don't have all the 3 meals every day. What kind of freedom is that? They live in cars, they live on the street, they don't have enough food. What kind of freedom is that? Because they can buy iPhones, they say, hey, my government is bad. You have no freedom if you don't have food to survive. First you need the basics, then you can fight for the rest.
When something bad happens in a particular sector, people are affected, yes. People lose their life savings, yes. People are plunged into poverty, yes. But when they try to do something about it or make a noise about it, they are silenced. They're either detained, arrested, all discussion of these things are censored online. And at the end of the day, all that you end up with is a whole lot of people who have had their lives ruined, but then they're silenced and pushed aside.
This guy is pointing to the communism and describing capitalism. 2 weeks ago, there was some human rights people fighting for the natives' rights in the US, because you know that the government doesn't really care about the natives in the US. Everyone got arrested. They were protesting on the street for natives' rights and got arrested. Nobody cares. The United States is the country that arrested most journalists in 2021. Nobody cares, because it's for democracy, it's for freedom. If China does it, then it's bad, it's dictatorship.
And it goes out of the social consciousness. People don't really continue to think about it. Think about the Evergrande collapse. That was big news around the world when it happened.
Yeah.
It is big news. Something like that should have shook the entire industry, which it did. It absolutely did in China. It absolutely did have massive ramifications throughout the real estate market and so on and so forth. But it really did not make a huge impact on the people in China. It didn't have the cooling off effect that you would expect in mainland China.
Why?
People still went out and bought houses. People are still buying houses now in China. Even though...
Why this didn't have a big impact in the regular people life in China? Because the government took control of the company, divided the company in many parts, put a lot of money, and Evergrande now is already managing new projects. That's why.
Even though a massive collapse of one of the biggest real estate companies in China, I mean, if that had happened anywhere else in the world, it would have had a massive cooling off effect. People would not be confident in the real estate market. People would not be buying houses. But because in China they were able to quash the protests, because there were people that lost huge amounts of money who'd invested in Evergrande.
Yes.
They quashed the protests, they pushed it aside, and once again filled the local news cycle with different things, Taiwan, for instance, and whatever else is going on in order to distract people.
No, China didn't feel anything with Taiwan. Pelosi came here. And after Pelosi, 12 or 16 other politicians from the US visited Taiwan. It was not China who started the Taiwan situation, it was the US.
Distract people. People have kind of forgotten about it, and it's been compartmentalized and pushed aside. So yes, the other YouTubers and financial experts that use a Western lens to point at China and say, look, the economy is going to collapse. Well, that's the problem. They are using a Western lens. There's this other
you are not,
going
right?
out there that the CCP is going to collapse.
You are not.
And that the CCP's end is near. And I have to tell you that this is not true. The CCP will not collapse.
Okay.
As much as it pains me to say so.
Well, I don't. I'm trying to understand if in this video he's a fan or a hater. I didn't get it.
CCP will not collapse and cannot collapse, and I'll explain to you why. It's not that the Chinese people don't want to rise up against the CCP when their freedoms are trampled on and when terrible things happen to them. It's that they can't. The last time there was an attempt to stand up to the CCP was still when China was in this big process of dramatic change. In the late 80s. You know, China had opened up to capitalism, was experimenting with that, there was a lot of change, and the young people decided to stand up, and we all know what happened in 1989 at Tiananmen Square. Countless young people and students.
Nothing happened at the square. It happened around the square in different streets, but at the square nothing happened. The ambassador of the United States said that nothing's happening at the square. I'm not saying nothing really happened. It happened, but not at the square.
And students were murdered by the government. That's the last time anyone was able to stand up. And prior to that, even more big atrocities happened under the governance of this exact same government. So for people to think that for some reason the Chinese people are going to stand up now against the government and revolt or try to force some kind of regime change, it just means that they don't understand China. Let me put it to you this way. Imagine the government has forced you and your family to be part of a commune that has to produce a certain amount of grain. And they send you out into the countryside and you have to go and do this. But because of their bad management and all the corruption and all this top-down leadership nonsense and these ridiculous policies of, well, instead of farming, we have to now produce steel, or let's kill all the sparrows, or whatever the case, everyone starts to starve. And the government has access to excess grain. They've got stores of grain that's there, just in case there is some kind of a food shortage or some kind of an emergency. They have access to that, but they refuse to give it to you. They have complete control over the food and who's allowed to eat what. They let people
die, right?
And you start to see your family members die of starvation one by one.
What these people fail to mention for whatever reason is since 1839, China was invaded by the UK for drug trafficking on the first Opium War, and then came the second Opium War, and then Taiping Revolution, and then first war with Japan, and then they overthrew the monarchy, the second war with Japan that became the World War II, and the civil war against the Kuomintang that in the end the Communist Party won. It was over 100 years of fightings and wars and all that bullshit. A lot of problems in China. It's not like after the Communist Party wins, you start on a new map, everything is fine, everything is nice, and everything is awesome. It's not like that. You have all the inertia to fight against it, all the problems that came. And also in 1958, there was a huge flood on the Yellow River that destroyed a lot of plantations in China. So you need to understand the context. Just saying that, oh yeah, of course, the government didn't want to give food to the people. This is at least stupid.
First your grandparents, some of your uncles, your aunts, your parents, your mother, your father dying in front of your eyes of starvation, and you still don't rise up against the government? Well, that's what happened in China. People started cannibalizing each other.
Of course
People
they did,
still
right?
praise the man,
Yeah,
Mao Zedong,
of course.
who stood over all of this and allowed it to happen. The person who willfully allowed people to starve, knowing very well that people were starving.
This number, 45 million deaths. This guy, I think it's from the US. Basically every death is because of Mao Zedong. Strokes, heart attack, diabetes, everything. They blame it the communism. That's how he counted. Or there's another guy who was analyzing the birth rates of China, and then there was a huge drop. And he said, oh, there's a huge drop. All these people was not born, so I will count as death. So China was basically killing people that was not even born. So that's how stupid it is. The official numbers, the numbers that I found in China are between 5 and 7 million. And also there's another layer in saying that was on purpose. As I mentioned, there was a lot of inertia of all the wars and poverty before the Communist Party won. When the Communist Party won the revolution, China was the poorest country in the world. The life expectancy was 35 years. When Mao Zedong dies in 1978, the life expectancy was already 70 years. That's the difference. The difference the Communist Party made in China. This is not true, the 45 million.
Knowing very well that he had access to all of this excess grain that he could have released to the public in order to save their lives. So you have to think about it in that context. Why would people in modern China now, who are not in as bad a position as the people were during the Great Leap Backwards and the Cultural Devolution, the bad old days of Mao Zedong, they're not in that bad a position yet. They're not starving to death. They don't have the military there shooting them for stealing a handful of rice or something like that. They don't have this terrible, terrible oppression.
It's funny because he's from South Africa, so he's basically describing what the UK did to the African people in South Africa.
That they suffered very recently in history, and I'm talking very recently, in the late 60s. I'm talking about while America was landing a man on the moon. This kind of crap was going on in China. So many people still alive that went through that. Now, that was terrible, and they endured that. They endured that, and they didn't revolt. They endured starving to death. They endured having all of their property taken away, their freedoms taken away. They endured it. So why would they not endure a situation where all their life savings are taken away, where their property is taken away, where the economy just slows down to an almost a halt? Well, of course they're going to endure it. They don't have a choice. Anyone who stands up will be dealt with by the PLA, as we've seen in the past. They've demonstrated this all throughout.
Okay, I talked with many Chinese about this, and the general answer is if we have food, education, house, we can travel, life is good, everything is awesome, everything is fine. Doesn't matter what's the system. Because as he mentioned, 3 generations ago, these people were fighting to survive. And now China is the second biggest economy in the world and will not stop. Soon they overpass the United States, and that's it. And guys like this will be crying on the internet.